My name is Gargi Sublogiger, and I'm here to talk about using template-level robophysical models to study sustained terrestrial locomotion of amphibious fish. Studying how fish move on land can help us to better understand amphibious locomotion, both in the past and the present. And this is relevant because the transition that early fish made onto land is what ultimately led to all terrestrial vertebrates present today, and many existing fish species still make that same transition. As Divya explained in the previous talk, mud is common in the transition zone at the land-water interface, both in the present and the past, but we still have a limited understanding of how fish move on mud. Now, mud can be characterized as a wet deformable substrate, and so it has unique properties, primarily that it can flow like a fluid if the forces applied to it exceed its yield strength. In nature, mud has both fine clay and coarse grains, and it can also have varying solid concentration as the water content varies. And both of these factors can affect its yield strength, which not only complicates locomotion, but also makes the control and variation of strength for systematic experiments challenging. Here, we're using fine clay as a model mud because its strength only depends on its solid concentration, which is also termed its volume fraction. And as Divya explained earlier, we have developed methods to prepare and control muds of varying volume fractions. So we have a model mud with precisely controlled strengths that can be varied systematically. To handle these locomotive challenges, amphibious fish have evolved a large variety of strategies for sustained locomotion on land. And although there are many variations, in general, they fall into one of three categories: appendicular, axial, and axial-appendicular motion. To study these strategies and uncover the general physical principles for locomotion that govern them, we propose that we can utilize template models. Templates are the simplest dynamic models that describe a locomotion behavior. By reducing the complexity of a system, they can be generally applied to diverse organisms and robots. For example, the SLIP template model was developed to characterize the dynamics for terrestrial running. And despite the simplicity of the model, it can accurately predict ground reaction forces generated by both organisms and robots. And additionally, despite the diversity in body plan, leg number, morphology, and kinematics, all of these legged organisms' running motion follows that same SLIP model template. And this fundamental understanding of running dynamics that we've gained from the SLIP model has led to the development of many amazing legged robots, as seen here. As we mentioned earlier, fishes display three main categories of sustained terrestrial locomotion strategies. Our lab has begun studying a model organism for each category moving on mud of a controlled strength. We propose that the following three templates be used for each category. For axial-based locomotion on mud, such that of the ropefish using body undulation, can be described by a surface swimming template. Appendicular-based motion on mud, as seen in the Mudskipper, which uses its fins to lift up and propel a flow forward, can be described using a crutching template. And finally, axial-appendicular motion, such as seen in that of a bashir, which uses a combination of both body and fins, can be described using an army crawling template. Then, we developed a preliminary template simulation for each of the three strategies that recreated the movement. And we can see that while the templates are much more simplified than the model organisms, they are able to generate biologically relevant motions. These templates, however, are still tentative as we are still studying the animals. And so for the rest of the talk, I will focus on our work developing simplified template-level robophysical models, which can be used to complement animal studies by exploring the parameter space to discover general principles of locomotion. Overall, robophysical models can complement both studies of model organisms and studies of template models in many ways. To start, since these models operate in the real world, they are subject to real-world physics, and therefore may generate interactions with complex environments that may have been missed by the simplified or theoretical template models. Additionally, robophysical models are much more amenable than organisms for systematic exploration of the parameter space, as you can perform controlled experiments with them, which is often difficult with organisms. Schultz et al. Developed a biomimetic lizard robot to explore the performance landscape of climbing in lizards. And we can see that through their parameter exploration, they were able to identify specific combinations of spine and limb range of motion that resulted in failures or optimal performance given morphological constraints. To utilize robophysical models for the study of amphibious fish, we must first identify the main relevant parameters to explore within each model. And because we focus on first-order template level models, our templates simplify body bending as a sinusoidal traveling wave, and we simplify fins as a segment from the body midline to the fin tip. On the right here are some of the parameters that describe the shape and actuation of the templates. As we built our robots, we played with some of these parameters, together with clay mud strength measured by its volume fraction. Later, I'll get into a couple examples of our early exploration, so you can get an idea of what we can really do with these robophysical models. Each of the 3 robots was custom made using servo motors, low-cost electronical and mechanical parts, and 3D printed parts. The robots were all waterproofed using sleeves made of plastic bags that were then sealed to the bodies using hot glue. And to mitigate the suction effects of mud and to mimic the mucus that these fish naturally secrete, medical lubricant was applied to the lower surfaces of the Mudskipper and Bashir robots. And finally, the Mudskipper and Bashir robots were also equipped with a torsion spring that connected its fins to the motor axle to better mimic the compliance in the fish's fins, which can later be tuned as well. All of the experiments were conducted in tubs of controlled mud, and methods for mud making and storage were explained in Vivia's earlier talk. And each robot was marked with evenly spaced white paint markers for motion tracking purposes, which was then conducted using Hedrick's DLT software. Some preliminary observations from the initial experiments to demonstrate the potential of these robophysical models. For the Mudskipper robot, we varied the volume fraction of the mud that the robot would traverse and found that as the volume fraction and correspondingly the strength of the mud decreased, so did the robot's performance. Starting with the highest volume fraction, the 39.2%, we can see that the robot has no issues moving forward. It's able to reach its maximum lift up and forward progression with each stride. However, if we take one step down in volume fraction to the 33.8%, we can see the robot begin to have some issues. As the fin contacts the mud with each rotation, it slows down, and the robot begins to get stuck in strides. If we take the volume fraction down one step further to the 27.4%, we can see that the robot really struggles to move forward and has minimal lift and forward progression per stride. Some potential future avenues we would like to explore are fin flexibility between a very compliant fin and a rigid fin, to see how the fin itself impacts lift in terms of how it changes interactions with the mud, as well as incorporating tail thrusting, which we observed that the mudskippers use when traversing weaker muds through our animal experiments. For the ropefish, we varied the shape of the wave that was propagated through the body by changing the wave number. And we found that a body wave with a wave number of 2.25 had better forward performance than a body with a body wave with a wave number of 3. And this is just showed that waveform matters. As we collect data on the ropefish, we'll vary wave parameters around the observed animal waveforms to study whether it may adapt to different mud strengths. Some potential future directions here are guided by preliminary animal studies, where we have observed that ropefish use diverse shapes to achieve turning and motion in various directions. And so we plan to use the robophysical model to vary waveforms to study these diverse strategies as well. We will also vary the volume fraction of the mud testbed to better understand how sinkage impacts locomotion and how the ropefish adapts to the changes in sinkage when locomoting. For the Bashir robot, we varied both the wave number of the body undulation and the rate of fin rotation, and we observed that the robot's forward speed varies with body waveform. Also, we would just like to acknowledge that the robot's cables sometimes pulled at the robot and induced turning, and we will improve this design by adding more slack and rerouting the cables. Based on our literature review, we've found that some amphibious fish species, like the snakehead, use both synchronous and asynchronous motions of the pectoral fins when implementing axial appendicular-based locomotion. And so one potential future direction that we plan to pursue is to vary the phase offset between the fins, as well as varying the phase offset between the fin rotation rate and the body undulation frequency. We would also like to emphasize that these are just preliminary results. We conducted these tests as we were building and tuning the robot to get them working, while also figuring out how to control the mud. And so we acknowledge that these findings may not be biologically the most interesting yet, but as we do animal experiments on mud and quantify how fishes move, and then consequently form new biological hypotheses, we can then find the right design parameters to explore. Furthermore, we can then use the developed models to analyze the behaviors observed in organisms. For example, the Robophysical models might reveal that for a large mass and surface area, forward progression is only possible when both pectoral fins are used in phase along with body undulation. But if we observe that a fish with similar characteristics employs an alternating fin strategy, this might be an indication that the fish is using some additional method to aid locomotion, which we can then further investigate. And now finally, I do want to emphasize this last takeaway, which is that through further modeling to assess performance landscapes, especially over a wider parameter space than what we observe from animal studies, we will be able to reveal general biomechanical principles and suggest alternative explanations to what we observe from the animal studies. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the help from all of my lab members in developing the experimental procedures and preparing the mud, as well as our mentors and our funding sources. Thank you.